If you are a gamer, you obviously head more towards the well-known games and franchises. Every gamer is guilty of that. But there's a problem with that method of choosing which games to play. It forces you to skip over lesser-known games that are still awesome, but few have heard of or played. Today, I dedicate this list to those underrated games that were really good and had so much potential, but were just skipped over by the general public. I give you my top 10 underrated games list. The rules are pretty much the same. One per franchise and only games I've played. Also, underrated means games I feel don't get as much attention as they should, and not just underrated gems that people have passed over. Therefore, don't be surprised if a popular game makes this list. It just means that I feel people should talk about it more. But with all of that in mind, let's begin. With a series as popular as Zelda, you would imagine that it would be really hard to find an underrated game in the franchise, but unfortunately, the Minish Cap didn't get as much love as it should have. The Minish Cap is the worst-selling Zelda game, but I don't really get why. It was just as good as, and if not better than any Zelda that came before it. The story was somewhat lame, but it did introduce a new villain to the Zelda series, Vaati, who was a great addition to the character lineup. The dungeons were incredibly solid, the gimmick didn't really feel like a gimmick at all, and the music was fantastic as always. The game also forced you to explore, but in a way that didn't really make you feel like you were forced. It encouraged exploration to find the next location or to find new kinstones. And that's another thing. The kinstone quests were pretty fun and they rewarded you properly. All in all, I just don't get why this game sold so poorly and isn't talked about very much. I would put it very high on my list of Zelda games. The only flaw, if I can even call it that, is that sometimes you are over-rewarded for exploration. Seriously, I mean, one time I accidentally pressed the B button by swimming, and when I went underwater I found a heart container by accident. That's a bit much, but I'm just nitpicking. Zelda the Minish Cap is an awesome experience that no Zelda fan should miss out on. Number 9 is Nostalgia for the Nintendo DS. I guarantee you have never heard of the game, but that's okay, because I want to tell you about it. Nostalgia is a JRPG for the DS, released by Ignition Entertainment in 2009 in North America. This game was made for one reason, and one reason only: to bring back the memories and style that the older Final Fantasy games brought to the table. As such, the game introduced no new innovations worth mentioning, and just stuck to the formula that worked since the original Final Fantasy, thus the name Nostalgia. And it worked too. The game had a very Final Fantasy-esque feel to it, but also had a modern twist. The story was pretty interesting, especially in the beginning. The game starts off with a cutscene where a group, known as the Ancient Fathers Cabal, is trying to use a girl to steal a tablet from the Tower of Babel. Out of nowhere, adventurer Gilbert Brown comes to her aid and saves her, but at the cost of almost losing his life. When Eddie Brown, Gilbert's son, hears about the news, he becomes an adventurer to look for his father, which leads him on a journey to stop the Cabal and save the world. I won't go into much detail about the story because I don't want to spoil it, but it has some great moments. However, the game's presentation was by far its best aspect. From the first cutscene, you're drawn in by the game's old-school feel and gorgeous graphical style. The great soundtrack only adds to the experience. Sure, it wasn't amazing, but it had quite a few standout tracks, such as this one entitled New York. One of my favorite things about this game is the fact that it doesn't take place in a fantasy world, but in 19th century Earth with a few fictional places thrown here and there. The game also had an odd upgrade system where instead of getting move upgrades by leveling up, you would gain SP after battles, which you could exchange for upgrades to your attacks. For example, your mage Melody starts with the basic fire spell Flanma, but instead of gaining the next level by leveling up, you can upgrade the spell to the level 2 spell, Flanmoa. This was an interesting take, and it worked really well. The only other thing worth mentioning is the overworld. Instead of traveling on foot, you travel the overworld via airship, which can be upgraded with new parts. There are also random encounters which can be dealt with by using the airship, which was basically the same as a standard random battle, but using airship parts instead of the characters, which was kinda cool. Apart from a fairly forgettable character cast, this game is definitely worth checking out if you have the chance. It is kind of watered down compared to other RPGs, but it's still an underrated gem in the DS collection that is worth checking out for sure. Number 8 is Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness and Pokemon Colosseum. Up next is the interesting take on Pokemon in the Ore region, Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD. These games strayed away from the Pokemon standard and were therefore looked upon poorly, but these games were simply amazing. I know I may be cheating by counting two games as one, but since they're so similar, I feel like I have to. The stories in these games weren't the usual beat gym leaders, beat evil organization, and beat Elite Four stories. These games had you capturing captured shadow Pokemon from the Eagle organization, Team Snag'em in Colosseum, or Team Cypher in XD. This was a unique concept that most players didn't like, but I loved it. Shadow Pokemon, once captured, had to be reverted back to normal in order to level up and learn new moves. So this is a unique and interesting way of finding partners to help you on your journey. This does lessen the replay value a bit, as Pokemon you can capture don't ever change, but it was still fun. The other thing worth mentioning was the music. The soundtracks for these games were phenomenal and included both remixes of well-known Pokemon tracks and original tracks. If you have a GameCube and skipped over these games as a child due to them being different, trust me when I say that different is not a bad thing, and that these games were a fresh take on the otherwise somewhat stale Pokemon franchise. I highly recommend these games to any Pokemon fan. A series that I neglect to ever talk about is the Professor Layton series. I do like Layton's Adventures, but I've really only played one game. When it comes to Layton's Adventures though, most people talk about Diabolical Box or Unwound Future, but no one ever talks about the franchise's humble beginnings in a curious village. Sure, this game isn't as moving or interesting as the other two, I would imagine, but it's great in its own right. The story was interesting for sure, what with this mysterious village. What did its inhabitants act so weird and love puzzles? Who was the mysterious man trying to stop you from figuring out the secret of the city? The story always had me going and wondering and interested. However, the main thing that makes this game is the gameplay. The puzzles in this game ranged from completely obvious to excruciatingly hard. This is good in many ways, as it was easy for new gamers and hard enough for veterans. I also liked the puzzles because they were more often based on logic and reasoning rather than math and memory. That's just the type of puzzle I prefer. With an interesting twist at the end and a great soundtrack to boot, more and more people should talk about this game. It might not have a story as engaging and moving as Unwound Future, but the gameplay and puzzles were top notch. This was a great start to an awesome franchise. As you all know, I love Okami. But what many people don't know is that Okami actually got a sequel, and it was pretty good. Though Okami Den wasn't quite as grand and epic as its predecessor, it was still an adventure to remember. Taking place a few months after the events of the original game, you play not as Ami, but as her son, Chibi Tarasu. After meeting your partner and unfortunately losing him, you go on a journey to look for him. Along the journey, you find many other partners and ultimately have to find a way to stop Akuro and his plans to use the blood of Hiroshi to revive the Dark Lord Yami. No, the story isn't as epic as that of the first game, but everything else comes pretty close in the grand scheme of things. The exploration is still there, the dungeons are fantastic and utilize the brush powers and partners perfectly, and the music and graphics are still stellar as ever. The bosses were also almost as fun as those of the first game. There really isn't much else to say about this game. It's basically the first game, just slightly less grand. Even though it's still not on the level that Okami was, it is a great game that shouldn't be overlooked by any DS owner or any gamer in general. If you liked Okami, I guarantee that you'll like Okami Den almost as much. Number 5 is Sonic and the Black Knight. At first glance, Sonic the Hedgehog and swords might sound a bit weird, but Sega and the Sonic team made it work surprisingly well. Sonic and the Black Knight draws you in from the start and keeps you there the whole way through. Starting with a cool and admittedly funny cutscene, you are introduced to the story, where your goal is to stop a corrupted King Arthur. With talking sword in hand, you are off on your adventure. To be honest, the swordplay doesn't add too much to the high-speed gameplay, but it does add a small layer of combat to some of the enemy and boss fights. Other than that, this game kept the standard and awesome high-speed gameplay that defines the Sonic franchise. This game also kept the quirky and humorous dialogue that lines the franchise, and as such, the game was incredibly charming. The boss fights were awesome. It's not often that one can say that they sword fought with the Knights of the Round Table as well as King Arthur and won. And the final boss is one of my favorites in the entire franchise. Definitely my favorite addition to Super Sonic. Sonic and the Black Knight is a very overlooked game that desperately needs more attention. This is once again an example of the fact that just because a game is different doesn't necessarily mean a game is bad. Sonic and the Black Knight was an awesome game and shouldn't be overlooked. Number 4 is Super Monkey Ball. Ah, memories. For those of you not familiar with this game, Super Monkey Ball is a GameCube game that was terrible in terms of story and such, but it's still one of the most addicting games of all time. Seriously, the story sucked, but everything else about this game was so charming that I just couldn't stop playing it. Just think about it. You're a monkey, trapped inside a marble, forced to roll around obstacle courses in order to save all the bananas on the island. Crappy story, I know, but the gameplay was addicting and the music was catchy as hell. And to be honest, that's really all there is to this game. It's overlooked, but if you do find it and play it, you'll be on your GameCube for hours rolling your monkey off a cliff. If you can find this game, play it. It's addiction at its finest. Number 3 is Luigi's Mansion. And here, we have another example of how different doesn't necessarily mean bad. Yes, Luigi's Mansion strayed away from platforming in exchange for an exploration and adventure game, but it was a great game nonetheless. Simple story, fun characters, immense amounts of charm, and so many places to explore and make for an unforgettable experience. The game gets extra points for adding some very iconic things, such as the Poltergust 3000, Luigi's Vacuum, and Professor Egad. You know, it's funny. The higher I get up the list, the less I have to say about the games. Everything I can say is pretty much redundant, and unless you play the game for yourself, you really won't understand much. As such, I can't really say anything else about Luigi's Mansion. It's quirky and charming and unfortunately overlooked for some reason, and if you haven't played it, I would recommend it to anyone. Everyone knows I love Pokemon. My channel is named after Pokemon. It's my second favorite franchise, and I upload Pokemon battles occasionally. So, with that in mind, it would make sense that if I like Pokemon, I would like a game that's similar to Pokemon. That's where the Fossil Fighters franchise comes in. The original Fossil Fighters was awesome. Find fossils, revive them, and pitch your team of dinosaurs against an opponent in a Pokemon-style battle. It was great. However, there was a sequel, and it was even better. Why the fuck does nobody on Earth talk about Fossil Fighters Champions? Seriously, this game is awesome. Everything that the original Fossil Fighters did right, this game did even better. The story was actually interesting with the tournament and all, and unfortunately giving any more information would spoil the story. The game came with a pretty memorable character cast, over 100 Vivisaurs to collect and train, which gives it a lot of replay value, catchy music, and eye-catching graphics. This game was made even better by including a cool twist at the end and one of the best final battles ever. Overall, this game is almost a Pokemon clone, which isn't a bad thing, but it does quite a few things better than Pokemon, and if you're a Pokemon fan, I guarantee you will love Fossil Fighters Champions. This game was great. The only difference between this and number 1 is that number 1 is less well known, and yet even better. I'm just gonna come straight out with this one. Number 1 is Radiant Historia for the Nintendo DS. This game is almost as elusive as Nostalgia, but it is an RPG on par with the likes of Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. Yes, it's that good. Radiant Historia is a game made by Atlus. You know, those guys who make the incredibly popular Persona series? Just that alone should tell you that this game is good, but I'll go into even more detail. The game takes place on a continent where there's much conflict. The power of mana is going crazy, and as such, much of the world is turning into sand. The desertification has spread across the entire continent. On top of that, there's a war going on between the country's two powerhouses, Alistel and Granora. You play as the main protagonist, Stock, who works for the Special Intelligence in Alistel. Your boss, Heist, sends you on a mission and introduces you to your helpers, Rainy and Marco. Before you leave, he also gives you a book with blank pages and tells you it's a good luck charm. After going on your mission, it royally screws up, and I believe Rainy and Marco die. However, after the screw up, the book lights up and you are introduced to the plot. You are brought to a dimension called Historia, where as guardians, Lipti and Teo explain the desertification and what you must do. It turns out that the book you got is called the White Chronicle, and it allows you to travel back in time to ensure that history travels on its right course. After you fix the messed up mission, your best friend Rosh asks you to join his brigade, and quit Special Intelligence. The cool thing about this is that you can actually pick both options by using the Chronicle to go back in time and pick the one you haven't picked the first time. This separates the story into two timelines, one where you stay in Special Intelligence, and one where you join Rosh's brigade. Each timeline has its own story, but sometimes you can't go any further into one timeline until something happens because you did something in another timeline. Honestly, this story and concept of traveling between timelines and back in time to fix messed up events is insanely cool, and is one of the best stories I've ever heard. However, the story isn't all that's good. The cast of characters are incredibly memorable too, not to mention the music. Holy shit, the music. The music is written by Yoko Shimomura. You know, that chick who wrote the music for Kingdom Hearts. That alone should tell you how awesome the music is, but if you don't believe me, I encourage you to look at the soundtrack. It's on par with even Chrono Trigger. There's even more though. The battle system was really cool. You could bring 3 party members to battle, but your opponents were on a grid. You were able to push and pull your opponents across the grid and manipulate their positions to increase your damage output, decrease their damage output, or attack multiple enemies at the same time. Another thing I love about this game is its lack of linearity. Puzzles and side quests in this game often caused you to think. They weren't just hit a switch to open the door, and the side quests were more than just fetch quests. They made you think. You had to figure out exactly where in the timelines to travel and what to do to trigger a certain event. They were really fun, and they always properly rewarded you for them. All in all, Radiant Historia is simply astounding. It's one of the best games I've ever played, and I would rank it among my top 5 favorite games of all time. Yes, it was that good. I rank it higher than the RPG greats of the SNES, like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and any other amazing RPG you can find. This was an over 30-hour adventure that completely changed the way I saw gaming. It taught me that even games with a name that I've never heard of before can be amazing. It's unfortunate that it's very rare to find a copy of this game, but if you can get your hands on one, I would recommend it to any hardcore RPG fan or hardcore gamer period. This is Zoroarkofthenight, and not only is Radiant Historia the most underrated game of all time, but also one of my favorites.